Awesome. We're going to begin our ES6 section by covering var, let, and const. And more specifically, why we would prefer using let and const over var. First, we're going to take a look at the main features of var. And those would be that we can define the variable using var, we can update the variable using var, as well as we can redefine the variable using var, which, by the way, is not a good thing. And that's going to be one of the main reasons why we would want to use let and const instead. So we're going to start simply by setting up a variable using var. We're going to go with number, and the number is going to be equal to 100. What are we doing right now? Well, we are defining a variable. Once we have defined the variable, next we can update the variable. But before we do that, why don't we console log it? We have the number, and clearly I can see the value is 100. All right. But in the next line, I could say, you know what? Number is going to be equal to 200. If we console log it, check it out. Right now, our number is going to be 200. Why? Because we were able to update our variable. Now, everything is awesome, but we can also redefine the variable. So later on, if I run out my variable names, I could also say var number, and then by mistake, I just say that number is going to be equal to an orange. If we console log it, you're going to see that JavaScript doesn't complain about that. So even though it technically doesn't make sense, where we already have the variable with a value of a number, later I can just say, you know what, I'm going to redefine my variable. And you know what, I am going to add some comments here. So in this case, we're updating. And then, of course, in this case, we are redefining. Redefine the variable. So now that we know that var can define, update, and redefine the variable, let's take a look at the let and const and how they would differ. And you know what? Before we set anything up, I am going to comment out all my console logs just so we have a clear console. And I'm going to set up my variable with a value of amount. So let amount, and in this case, we are using let, and this is going to be equal to 100. Okay. So again, we have some kind of number. If we would want to console log it, of course, we're going to get in a console 100 because that is the value for my variable. And we can also update. So if later I said if amount is equal to 200, then if we console log it, then of course the amount is going to be 200. Why? Because we are allowed to update our variables when we're using let. However, let's try redefining our variable. So let's do the same thing where let amount is equal to an orange. Do you think we're going to be able to do that or no? And I can see a big fat error in the console. What is the error saying? It's saying identifier amount has been already declared. So we cannot do that with let and const. We cannot redefine our variables. More specifically, when we're using const, not only we cannot redefine the variable, but we also cannot update. And to show you that, I'm going to comment everything out just so I don't have the errors as well as the rest of the values are not being console logged. And we're going to take a look at the const. So if we go with const, and in this case, I'm going to set this equal to the total. Total is going to be 100. And if we console log it, of course, we should get a total of 100. But if on the next line, I'm trying to set equal total to, let's say, 200, again, we're going to have a big fat error. And the error is saying assignment to a constant variable. So not only we cannot redefine the variable, which we're not able to do with let, and I'm not going to show you because, again, we already looked at it when we covered let, but we also cannot update the value. Please keep in mind that only works if we're working with primitive types. So when we're using const, we cannot mutate the primitive types. What would be primitive types? Well, that could be a string or could be a number, just to name a few. But we can mutate if we're using the reference type. So first, let me comment this out just so I don't have the error, as well as my console is clean. Like so, let me save it. I have total, awesome. But if we're going to come up with a different name, and the name is going to be, let's say, person, and that is going to be equal to an object. So in this case, there's going to be a property by the value of name, and we're going to set this equal to Bob. If on the next line, I go with person and name, and if I'm going to reassign the value, you're going to see that we are allowed to do that. So if we're going to go with John, and then of course later we're just going to console log it, you're going to see that the person name is not equal to Bob. It's going to be equal, in fact, to a John. So let's go with person name. And of course, now it is equal to John because we cannot reassign if we're using primitive types, like, for example, string and number. However, if we have a reference type like object, like array, in fact, the values within the object or the array, we can mutate even when we're using const. Let me emphasize, though, that we cannot reassign a person to a different value. If we have it as an object, even though we can change the values within our reference, within our object, we cannot say on the line 26 that the person is going to be equal to a string. So I just cannot say person is equal to, I don't know, a orange. That is not allowed. We can, of course, mutate the values, but we cannot just reassign our whole value altogether.